Prime Minister, your government is currently advertising the Working Nation program, saying to the 9% of Australians still unemployed it will give them more hope. What hope can Australians have in a Prime Minister who stole away his major commitment at the last election, $3.5 billion worth of tax cuts legislated for the 1st of January next year? And how can you willfully advertise the Working Nation program this week at the same time as you, the Treasurer and the Finance Minister have agreed to gut $2.7 billion out of it over the next 4 years?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker,
Order.
let me just, on the point about the first point, the veracity of the election commitments, the tax cuts have been paid.
Order.
That's the first ones.
Order. Prime Minister, just wait for a moment. I have repeatedly said this week that ministers are entitled to be heard in silence and Standing Order 55 will be applied. I again appeal to members to adhere to that standing order. The Prime Minister.
The tax cuts were in two tranches. The first was brought forward, the second put back, which were agreed by both houses of Parliament. Now, Mr. Speaker, the second round of tax cuts, the government will be making its position clear about those as promised in this year's budget. So the first lot, just get the symmetry right. First lot paid. Second lot, wait for the budget and you'll see it. Now, Mr. Speaker, and let me just say, Mr. Speaker,
Order.
the government paid all of the tax cuts between 83 and 93 that it said it would pay. Billions upon billions of tax cuts. One tax cut after another which was used to reduce wage demands and bring down Australian inflation. They were commitments made and they were commitments honoured. This is in sharp contrast to the opposition, Mr. Speaker, when as a government, and let me today quote from this article in The Age, which says, the tax master of the past feigned shock, referring to the leader of the opposition. And it says this, in Mr Howard's budget, it said, Mr Howard broke the government's fistful of dollars campaign promise of a few months earlier and gave only half indexation of income tax. At a time of high inflation, this raised extra revenue equivalent to $3 billion in today's economy. He introduced the crude oil levy to raise domestic oil prices to world parity levels. This bumped up petrol prices by 15 to 20%, raising the equivalent of $3.5 billion in a full year. Imposed a 1.5% temporary surcharge on income tax, raising $2.5 billion. Of course, no mention of the temporary surcharge in the previous election. Thumped up taxes on beer, spirits and cigarettes by an equivalent of $2 billion. Scrapped tax deductions for home loan interest payments. And the article goes on to say, he raised tax from 23.8% of GDP to 26.1%. That is, he raised tax by 2% of GDP. In today's dollars, 2% is $10 billion. $10 billion. Now, Mr. Speaker, this followed an election where the leader of the opposition, as the then Treasurer, was going to give tax cuts.
Member for Gippsland.
Ring up and find out how much the tax cuts were. There were the fistful of dollars photographs from their advertising agency and the newspapers. Mr. Speaker, that's the reference I made to Ronald Biggs. You see, he doesn't have a past. I mean, how dare Mr. Colbatch from The Age dare mention these things? Don't we know the Liberal Party has given him a clean bill of health? They've rubbed away his identity. So when you see him in the carnival shirt and the maracas, it's not really him at all. No, it's not him at all. It looks like Biggs, it talks like Biggs, it thinks like Biggs, but it's not Biggs. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, that deals with the veracity of the appropriate election commitments. And Mr. Speaker, after the government's been in office 12 years and paid one tax cut after another, to have these sorts of questions with these imputations in them is, of course, without any veracity whatsoever. But, Mr. Speaker, on the very thing of labour market programs, in the Fight Back program, I noticed somebody's lifted ACME from the drawers. Some light-fingered person, it wouldn't be over there, would it? There's someone over there running around with my copy of Acme Fight Back. No, it's a different one. No.
Order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. The House will come to order.
Mr. Speaker, mine
The
was...
House will come to order.
Mr. Speaker, mine was an early copy. Mine was a typewritten job. Mine was the big typewritten number.
Order. The House will come to order, Prime Minister. The House will come to order. We've all had our laugh, the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, they must hand out laughing gas over there before each... I mean, maybe you all have a little sniff. Rather than being petrol sniffers, you're laughing gas sniffers, you know, the sort of whip gives you a little whiff on the way in. You know.
Order, the House will come to
The Lord
order.
Haw-Haws. No, let me get it right. The Lord's Haw-Haw over there. You won't laugh your way back into office, let me assure you. Now, Mr. Speaker, I actually had an early typed original of Fight Back. I thought it was, something that could later throw to the National Gallery of Australia at some appropriate point when we're done with it. Including with, I thought, the Acme edition, which improved it. But, Mr. Speaker, from it is, on labour market programs, a reduction of $300 million in your last election manifesto.
Order. The
300
member
million.
for,
So
the
you're
Deputy Leader of the
talking
Opposition
about-
already been warned.
You're talking about Working Nation, which is a program to support the long-term unemployed, to train them, to get them back into the labour market, to give them a future, to make Australia more equitable and more cohesive, to bring labour market skills formation and skills complementation to the labour market in the right part of the recovery cycle. The thing you described as a spending spree, which you would, as a government, wipe out, support for the long-term unemployed, support for them through Working Nation, and which at the last election you said you would take $300 million from the then $750 million of labour market programs. Hardly the sort of background I would think, from somebody who wants to ask a question about it. Hardly the sort. You've said you'll cut the programs to pieces. You've described the government's quite revolutionary approach to labour market programs as a spending spree. You don't believe in the social equity of giving the long-term unemployed a place in the labour market. You don't even believe in the economic efficiency of having better skills formation and complementation at the right part of the cycle by bringing the long-term unemployed and young people into the thing, but rather you want to score what you think is a cheap parliamentary shot from a program you said was a spending spree on programs that you actually said you would cut. Mr. Speaker, I think no more needs to be said about the question.